we're going to pause here and go into another issue. And it is an aqadi issue, a theological issue. But it is an issue that is very relevant and people always ask about it. And this is one of the main stories that is used in a discussion of this theological issue. And that is the issue of, can the dead in the grave hear or not? Can the dead in the grave hear or not? This is an issue that, as I said, always people ask about. If you go visit your relative, your grandmother, your uncle, if you visit a person in the grave, does the person know you are outside the grave, you are listening, or you can hear? Sorry, not you are listening, but that person is listening to you. Can he know that a visitor is at his grave? This is a very big theological question that even the Sahaba differed over. Even the Sahaba differed over. And this incident of Badr is one of the most important evidences used by both sides. It's an authentic evidence. Everybody knows it is there. The interpretation is the issue. Now, even the Sahaba, so it is said, for example, that Ibn Umar would say that the person in the grave can hear the one that visits him, and he even said that the person in the grave will be punished by hearing his relatives cry for him. By hearing his relatives cry, what is called niyaha al-mayyit. Niyaha al-mayyit means wailing over the dead. Wailing over the dead, for example, to say, how am I going to live? Who's going to support me? You know, how are we going to live after this? This is wailing over the dead. And there is a hadith which is not exactly directly relevant to this, but the Prophet ﷺ said in one version of the hadith that the one in the grave will be punished when his relatives do this. And Aisha denied this and said, no. The one in the grave will not even hear them. How can he be punished? Rather, the actual hadith is that. So that's not exactly relevant to the point. The point here is that Ibn Umar affirmed that the dead can hear the wailing. Ibn Umar affirmed the dead can hear the wailing. Aisha said, no, the dead cannot hear the person outside. Did you not read in the Quran, Surah Fatir, verse 22, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ? So Aisha used something in the Quran. وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. You will not be able to make the one in the grave hear you. So Aisha denied this interpretation. Forget the issue of niyaha al-mayyit and ta'dhib al-mayyit. That's not relevant now. The issue is Ibn Umar affirmed hearing. Aisha said, no, this is incorrect. The dead cannot hear. Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. And there are other Quranic evidences as well. Surah Ar-Rum, verse 52. Allah says in the Quran, فَإِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى وَلَا تُسْمِعُ الصُّمَّ الدُّعَاءَ إِذَا وَلَّوْا مُدْبِرِينَ. You cannot make the mawta hear. فَإِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. Nor can you make the deaf person hear when you call out to them, especially when they turn their backs and they walk away. So in this ayah, it is as if Allah is saying, al-mawta is like a sum. He's comparing the dead person to a deaf person. Also in Surah An-Naml, verse 80, Allah says, وَمَا يَسْتَوَى الْأَحْيَاءُ وَلَا الْأَمْوَاتِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُسْمِعُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. That Allah says in the Quran, the living and the dead are not the same. Allah can make anything He wants hear, but you cannot make the dead hear. وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. So all of these ayat are used to talk about the fact that the dead cannot hear. And one can say it seems very explicit from the Quran. From the Quran, there does not appear to be any evidence to suggest that the dead can hear. Clear? The Quran seems to say very clearly that the dead cannot hear. Clear? Right? Now, let's look at the ahadith. A number of ahadith seem to suggest that the dead can hear. Hence the controversy. This is why the controversy arises. So, of the ahadith is the hadith in Sahih Bukhari. That is a very long hadith that the Prophet ﷺ mentions what happens to the grave, what happens to the soul when it dies, and a very long hadith. One phrase in it is of relevance to us. That the Prophet ﷺ said that the person in the grave, he hears the footsteps of those who have come to bury him as they return. The one in the grave, when he is buried, this is at the burial. So the Prophet is talking about what happens to the ruh, and it goes up and it goes down. The righteous goes up, the evil goes down. And then Munkar and Nakir, all of this. So in this there's a phrase that the one in the grave will hear the people who have come to bury him as they walk back. He will hear, or she will hear, the soul will hear the footsteps on the ground as they go back to the houses, basically. Right? This hadith is in Bukhari. Pretty clear, pretty explicit, that they will hear the footsteps going back. Another evidence that is used is the famous hadith in Bukhari and Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ visited Baqi' al-Gharqad, Jannatul Baqi' as we call it, Baqi' al-Gharqad, and he said, Assalamu alaykum, ahla qawmin min al-muslimina wal-mu'minin. So he's saying, Assalamu alaykum. Why would he say Assalamu alaykum unless the people can hear? Right? Assalamu alaykum to the people of the grave. Assalamu alaykum. So this is another evidence. Another evidence that is used is the mutawatir hadith, well known in every single book of hadith, that the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever sends salam upon me, Allah will send an angel to tell me that they have given salam. Right? Whoever sends salam upon me, an angel will come and tell me that so-and-so is sending salam. There's also a hadith that says, now this hadith is very explicit, whoever passes by the grave of anybody whom he knew and says salam, the one in the grave shall recognize who said salam, and he shall return his salam to him. Now, this hadith is very explicit. However, it is clearly a weak hadith. It is not mentioned in the 6 books. It's mentioned in some of the more obscure books, Ibn Hibban and Ibn Asakir and Tariq Damashq, some of the more obscure books, and it is very clearly a weak hadith. It's not in the famous Kutub al-Sitta or Kutub al-Tis'a. Had this hadith been authentic, then end of story. It's very clear, but it's not authentic. Of the evidences that is used is the hadith of Amr ibn al-As. It's not a hadith, it's his own statement, his own wasiyah, that he's telling his children that when he's telling him what to do after he dies, and one phrase in there says, so when you bury me, stay at my grave for the length of time it takes to slaughter an animal and distribute the meat. Now this phrase, slaughter an animal, distribute the meat, is found in other ahadith as well. It must have been a unit of time for them. Right? I mean, they have something, they don't have 20 minutes on a watch. So this is like a phrase that they would use. For the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal and give the meat out, I would say an expert slaughterer can do it all in half an hour. Is that reasonable? Right? An expert slaughterer can, take a goat in half an hour, just do it and cut it up. Right? In half an hour, 25 minutes, maybe even less, I don't know. So the point being, we have a rough idea that stay at my grave for this amount of time. Half an hour, however it might be. Why? What is Amr ibn, Amr ibn al-As, who is he? The father of Abdullah, the famous Sahabi, the very last Sahabi who can remind me? Come on, I went over the story of conversion. I don't understand, you guys are taking notes. It should be like, somebody redeemed you. The last from Mecca, the last who made hijrah, right? The last who made hijrah is Amr ibn al-As. You guys forgot. Of those 3, the last 3 who made hijrah. Allah Azza wa Jalla blessed Amr to be of the last 3 who made hijrah, right? So Amr ibn al-As, when he's about to die, he says, wait at my grave for this amount of time. Why? Asta'nisu bikum. Your presence will calm me down. He's telling his children and his loved ones, stay at my grave, your presence will calm me down. Until once I am calm and recollected, I will be able to answer to Munkar and Nakir when they come. This is a very explicit hadith where he's basically saying, I'm going to be terrified, I'm going to be lonely and scared. Stay with me as friends and comforters for a while. Let me calm down. Asta'nis means to basically get comfort from you, right? Once I am comforted, then I'll know how will I respond to the messengers from my Lord. He didn't say Munkar and Nakir, he said the messengers of my Lord, meaning Munkar and Nakir. Clear? Right? So this is a very explicit hadith that Amr ibn al-As thinks that the people at the grave will give him comfort. Right? This is another evidence that is there. Now, so this is the position, by the way, of many of the scholars. So much so it is said that this is the majority of the ummah. They said that the dead can hear those who visit. Now obviously the dead can hear those who visit, not anybody in the world. Nobody said this, right? The dead, according to this group, if you go visit the grave and you say salam, then the person in the grave will be aware that so-and-so is sending salam. Okay, now who said this position? This is Jumhur, really, frankly. This is the majority position. We have, I have like 10 names here, some of them. Ibn Hazm, An-Nawawi, As-Suyuti, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Al-Qayyim as well held this position. The both of them held this position as well. Allama Shanqiti in our times, this is a majority position. And Ibn Kathir, a lot of scholars, they held this position, and it is clearly the majority position. Now, of course, their main evidence is the incident of Badr. This is their main evidence. That's why I went into this tangent here. That the Prophet ﷺ explicitly said, what did he say? They can hear me just as well as you can. Right? So this is like the most explicit evidence. And that's why I wanted to go into this, because the incident of Badr is always used to be the most important and the most explicit evidence. Okay. What is the other opinion? In response to this, other people, starting from Aisha radiallahu anha, right? So they have Sahaba and they have Sahaba. Both groups have Sahaba. And both groups have Tabi'un. And both groups have great Imams. And by the way, this shows us that in some issues, even in Aqeedah, there is difference of opinion in Sunni Islam. In some issues, there are a minority of issues, handful of issues. Even in theology, Sunnis differed. And this is one of those issues that the Sunnis themselves differed in. This is not an issue where one Aqeedah says this, Hatta Ibn Taymiyyah, no, nothing like this, right? Even some scholars of the Athari or the Ash'ari tradition on one side, and the other scholars as well on the other side. So this is not something that is a theological dispute. It is something within the Sunni madhahib. So what did the other camp say? On the other side we have Aisha, Umar ibn al-Khattab. We have Qatada. We just mentioned, what did Qatada say? What did Qatada say in this very narration? That he's trying to explain how can the dead hear. So he said Allah brought them back to life. Not that the dead can hear, but he said Allah brought them back to life so that they could hear. Right? Because he could not posit an opinion that says the dead can hear. So what does he say? Allah brought them back to life. This is Qatada's interpretation. This is not the Prophet. This is not the Sahaba. This is Qatada. We have as well the famous Al-Bayhaqi, Ibn Atiyya, Ibn Al-Jawzi, Ibn Qudama, Al-Suhaili, Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la Al-Hanbali, Al-Shawkani. In our times, Shaykh Al-Albani has written an entire booklet on this, that the dead cannot hear, and he has a lot of evidences in there. Now, how do you reinterpret all of these ahadith? We just mentioned more than half a dozen ahadith. What do you do? So, and how do you respond to this? So, firstly, they say that the verses of the Quran are very explicit. Oh, I forgot to mention, how did the other camp interpret those verses? Sorry, I forgot to mention this, right? How did the first camp interpret all of those verses that says the dead cannot hear? I forgot to mention that, right? The dead cannot hear. The Quran says, at least in 3-4 verses, the Quran says the dead cannot hear, right? How did the majority interpret those verses? They have a number of interpretations. The first interpretation is, the meaning of hear is not to hear just hearing, but rather a hearing that will benefit. A hearing that you will follow up to. Not just a physical hearing. And they have an evidence for this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Naml verse 81, Surah An-Naml verse 81, that you will only cause those to hear, إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ, what is the, my mind is getting blank now. Naml 81, مَا يُؤْمِنُ بِآيَاتِنَا وَهُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ نَسْمَعُ. No, there is no mota here. Naml 81, you will only cause those to hear who believe in our signs. We have 4 huffaz sitting in the audience, and they're all blanked out, including myself. Innaka, I'm telling you the verse, Naml 81. I want to know it because I myself am stumped right now. He's looking up Naml 81. We have 7 iPads, 4 iPhones, 3 real mushafs, and we're still waiting. Naml 81. You'll get it. No, وما أنت بهذا العمي ضلال. إن تسمع إلا من يؤمن بآياتنا فهم مسلمون. Right? إن تسمع إلا من يؤمن بآياتنا. The only people that you can make to hear are those who will believe in our signs. What is the hearing here? Those who follow Islam. Not the hearing just to physically hear. So they have a verse in the Quran where they say, look, the hearing is a reference to hearing and following, not just hearing with the ears. Is that clear? You understand this point, right? The second interpretation is the dead in the Quran is not a physical death, but rather the spiritual death. إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. Al-Mawta is not the one who's dead. Al-Mawta is the one who's a kafir. And they have evidence for this as well, because Allah says in the Quran, Surah Al-An'am, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ. Give the example of the one who was dead and we gave him life. And the meaning here of death and life is kufr and Islam. So Allah calls the kafir mayyit. So another interpretation is إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. You cannot make the kafir hear you. This is another interpretation, right? Has nothing to do with the mawta there, right? Now the problem comes that with that interpretation is that Allah very explicitly says that وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. In one ayah he says mawta, but in another ayah he says man fil qubur. And man fil qubur clearly means those in the grave. That's very explicit, right? So in any case, that's how they interpreted the ayat of the Quran. Okay, camp number 2, Shawkani and others like him, Ibn Qudama, Al-Qatada, what did they say? They said that while it is true that mawta can refer to the kafir, in these verses it refers to the dead because of the verse that says man fil qubur, as I just said, right? That these verses they refer to the one in the grave. As for your point of saying the Quran talks about hearing of benefit, this can be refuted through Surah Fatir verse 14. They bring another evidence from the Quran. Surah Fatir verse 14, where Allah says in the Quran, إن تدعوهم لا يسمعوا دعاءكم ولو سمعوا ما استجابوا لكم ويوم القيامة يكفرون بشرككم ولا ينبئك مثل خبير. Allah is talking about all of the false entities that you call out. All of the false gods. Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, Jesus Christ, Jibreel, the angels, they're calling them daughters of God, right? And they call them out. What does Allah say? When you call them, لا يسمعوا دعاءكم. They can't even hear you. ولو سمعوا. Even if they could hear, ما استجابوا لكم. They couldn't have the power to respond. So the reference is very clearly, they can't even hear when you call out. Only Allah is as-Sami'. When you say, oh Jesus, He cannot hear you. When you say, oh Allat, and Allat was a human being. We did this in Aqidah class. Allat was a human being, right? The five false gods of Nuh were human beings, right? That وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَةً وَلَا تَذَرُنَّ وَدًّا وَلَا سُوَاعًا وَلَا يَغُوثَ وَيَعُوقَ وَنَصْرَ. These 5 were human beings, right? And the Arabs would worship them up until the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So Allah is saying they were human beings.
But they weren't gods when they were human beings. They were gods afterward.
But they were humans. They're dead. And so Allah is saying they cannot hear you when you call them out. They're in the grave. Right?
The idols, not the actual person.
The idols were humans in the beginning. And the same goes for Jesus Christ. The same goes for Jesus Christ. The same goes for anything that is worshipped. It's an unconditional ayah that when you make dua to them, إِن تَدْعُوهُمْ لَا يَسْمَعُوا دُعَاءَكُمْ. They cannot even hear you. وَلَوْ سَمِعُوا. Even if they could hear you, مَا اسْتَجَابُوا لَكُمْ. They couldn't even respond. وَيَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ يَكْفُرُونَ بِشِرْكِكُمْ. And on the day of judgment, they will do kufr of your shirk. Yakfuruna bishirkikum. You did shirk, they will say we have nothing to do with this shirk that you have done. They will do kufr of your shirk. And this shows us the reference is to entities like Jesus Christ. Because only Jesus and the righteous will yakfuruna bishirkikum. Right? So that's a very explicit verse from the other camp. Now another evidence that they have, how do you explain all of these ahadith? As for the incident of Badr, they say this is the strongest evidence against you and not for you. They changed the incident 180 degrees. How so? They say Umar questioned, how could these people hear when they're dead? The Prophet ﷺ did not correct him and say, Ya Umar, the dead can hear. What are you talking about? Rather, he made an exceptional case. Oh Umar, إنهم الآن, right now, this group can hear me just as well as you can. An exception in time and in place and in people. And he didn't say, oh Umar, why are you asking such a question? Don't you know the dead can hear? You see the difference between the two responses, right? He made a very clear exception that they are hearing me right now just as well as you can, right? And this clearly shows that Umar understood the Quran correctly. إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. And now he's questioning, how can you speak? And the Prophet is not correcting that misunderstanding, because it is not a misunderstanding. It's a correct understanding. And the Prophet is simply saying, this is a miracle, basically. Special time and place. How about the other evidences? The issue of the footsteps. The dead can hear the one in the burial going back. Once again, the Prophet is making an exceptional time and place. That this is not any person who visits him. This is at the time of burial. And we know in authentic ahadith that the ruh will come back to the grave right now for Munkar and Nakir. Right? The ruh will come and be reunited with the body in the alam al-barzakh to respond to Munkar and Nakir. So the Prophet is basically telling us at that point in time, the footsteps of those who walk back, those footsteps on the top of the ground, they will be heard by the one in the grave. Not conversations, not hello, hi, how are you doing? Rather, just the reverberations from the top of the grave for that period of time when the soul is reunited with the body. Once again, there is a clear exceptional clause that makes logical sense. As for the issue of the Prophet ﷺ going to Baqi' and saying Assalamu alaikum ahla qawmi min al-muslimin al-mu'minin, yes, he did say Assalamu alaikum, but this is the salam of dua and not the salam of tahiyyah. I.e., this is a dua he's making for the dead and not a greeting of salamu alaikum. Because assalamu alaikum literally means may Allah's peace be upon you. So he is saying assalamu alaikum and he means it. He's making dua for them. Where did you get that the dead can hear from this? There's no evidence at all that he is saying may Allah's peace be on you, O people of the grave. And there's no evidence here that the dead can hear. And that's actually very valid. That from this hadith, you don't get anything about the dead hearing. As for the
Salam hadith is an example.
yeah, but there's no evidence of hearing, is my point. As for the hadith of the dead person recognizing the one who says salam to him, we said this is weak, and pretty much every scholar of hadith who studies hadith says it is weak. As for Amr ibn al-As and his wasiyyah to his children, we say this is his interpretation. The Prophet did not tell him to do it. And some of the Sahaba, Aisha and Umar, are authentically reported to have denied the dead can hear. So this seems to be from the Sahaba's time. As for the ahadith of the Prophet that the angels come and give him salams, once again this is a very explicit evidence against and not for. Because if the Prophet ﷺ could hear directly, he wouldn't need the angels to go tell him. The very fact that an angel has to convey the salam indicates what? He cannot hear. And Allah is telling an angel to go convey the salam. And by the way, this is a common misunderstanding. It doesn't matter whether you're in front of the grave or whether you are in America. The angel will go in to give him the salam. Visiting the grave of the Prophet, of course, it's an emotional experience, it's an iman builder, of course. But in terms of how your salam will get to him, it's all going to be from the angels, right? How your salam will get to him. So, you being in front of the grave versus you being in America, the angel will go and tell him. Therefore, if even the Prophet requires an angel, what does this show about? The salam that can be heard, it cannot be heard. Therefore, in my humble opinion, one of the few things I would disagree with Ibn Taymiyyah about, in my humble opinion, it does seem to be that the dead cannot hear. And Allah knows best. We shouldn't be too strict about this issue because some of the Sahaba had the other opinion. And it is true to say that many scholars held the position that the dead can hear the one who visits them. Many scholars held this position, right? So the main point that we need to emphasize before moving on, this is a theoretical issue. لا ينبني عليه عمل, as they say. No action is derived from this. It's a theoretical issue. By unanimous consensus, you don't go to the grave and start having a conversation or start asking the dead for your needs, which is shirk, right? Or such jahala you see sometimes in the Muslim world. When somebody is buried, somebody's going to stand there and say, oh, so and so, Munkar and Nakir are going to come. Make sure you say that Allah is your Lord. Now you pause for a melodramatic effect. Now say that the Prophet is your Prophet. Then you pause again. Now say that, this is jahala. Wallahi, it's complete stupidity. Who are you to answer on his behalf? I mean, do you really think he needs you to be telling him? And they call this talqeen al-mayyit, right? In many cultures and societies, you will have this talqeen al-mayyit, right? And wallahi, you just wonder how foolish people are. You really think that at this point in time, he can cheat on his exam, right? Because that's what's happening, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're going to cheat on your exam, that somebody's shouting the answer for you, and just because you're shouting, you're going to give the answer. And you really wonder at the mentality of these people. So, what I'm trying to say is, even if you say that the dead can hear in the grave, there's no action that will come.